Hello everyone, my name is Nicole Fegan, and it has been a weird year for art. I didn't especially like a single movie from 2020, and yet there were so many amazing albums, and in this video I'm going to talk to you about my 10 favorite albums from this year. Jumping in at number 10, we have my favorite hip-hop album of the year, and that was Purple Moonlight Pages by R.A.P. Ferreira. This is a jazz rap album, and I feel like it really delivers on the promise of its genre. The lyrics are really poetic and beautiful, and yet at the same time, like, the backdrop melody is like so heavily influenced by jazz that it creates this incredible vibe throughout. I feel like it's one of those hip-hop albums that if you read along with the lyrics you can get so much from it, because again, I believe the R.A.P. in R.A.P. Ferreira's name stands for rhythm and poetry. You just get that beautiful language from it, but at the same time, if you just sat there and had it in the background, it'll just give you this incredible feeling. My two personal favorite tracks were Cycles, which has this almost slowcore vibe. I got duster elements from it, and then Leaving Hell, which is just funky and fun to listen to, and I would really recommend this. Number 9, we had How I'm Feeling Now by Charli XCX, which is I feel like a quarantine album for so many people. This album kind of finds itself at the midpoint between bubblegum bass and electropop. If you don't know what bubblegum bass is, it's basically this genre that is kind of this mix of electronic and pop and has all these wonky elements in it. I've personally always been more drawn to Charli X's electropop side, so my favorite tracks on this are Forever, which is probably my favorite song by her, and Detonate, which do have that really nice electronic element to it without being too jarring and wonky out there. But overall, I feel like the lyrics on this thing kind of get at what we were all feeling, how I'm feeling now, especially in March, April, May, when all this was starting. So if you haven't heard it, I definitely recommend it, especially for this wackadoo year. Number 8, we have Fetch the Bolt Cutters by Fiona, which was such a cultural milestone this year. It got the first 10 from Pitchfork for the first time since My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy in 2010, so this was a big moment of the year. This album is an art pop singer-songwriter art rock album, and I feel what I appreciate about it so much is that it's unlike anything else I've ever heard. I feel this album so adequately understands the anger of being a woman in relationships and in the world, and it expresses that not only lyrically but sonically. More than any other album I've ever heard, I feel this album uses percussion, and not just drums, but percussive elements and rhythm as arguably the most important thing about the song outside of the actual vocals. So while some of my favorite tracks on here do obviously have beautiful melodies, I think Cosmonauts and Heavy Balloon are just two of the best tracks of the whole year. I think that when you sit down and listen to this whole thing, it's this harsh, angry, and yet beautiful document of this woman's feelings about being in the world, and it's just so powerful, and it sounds awesome. Number 7 is another big album of the year, and that is Punisher by indie darling Phoebe Bridgers. A funny thing about me and Phoebe is I feel I've kind of been there with her from the beginning. I listened to her her debut album Stranger in the Alps when it came out in September of 2017, so it's been really awesome to kind of watch her career completely progress to this point. Punisher is an indie folk singer-songwriter album that I feel takes Phoebe's very dreamy atmosphere from her first album and kind of amps it up a notch with horn elements and just more lush production and bigger vibes. I feel the album has some songs that kind of take her light and dreamy sound to the next level. You have Kyoto and I Know the End that have this very large horn section, but you also have some songs that are much more on a smaller scale, like Chinese Satellite, which is kind of soft and simmering, or maybe my favorite song on the album, Graceland 2, which is this very light, dreamy, and beautiful song about female friendship. I think I might vaguely prefer her debut to this album still, but definitely one you should check out if you kind of like that whole indie scene. Number 6 is one I listened to in the last week and kind of just popped out of nowhere, which is What's Tonight to Eternity by Cindy Lee. This is a weird little noise pop album. Technically, the genre is hypnagogic pop, if I even pronounce that correctly. We're not even gonna go into the technical terms, let's just talk about what it sounds like. I saw someone describe this album as a 60s album left out in the sun too long, which is a perfect description for it. I love things that are fuzzy, things that are either from the 1930s to the 1960s or sound like they could have been from that. And I think what this album does so well is it has this almost doo-woppy vibe at times. It has this noise element, and yet under this filter of fuzzy sonics. I feel this is one of the albums from the year that I couldn't tell you a single lyric from it, but I remember the vibe of listening to it, and it's kind of exactly what I look for in music. Just this old-timey thing with modern songwriting and composition that like keeps it very intriguing but also gives you this like very nostalgic vibe. Up to our top 5, and at number 5 we have Heaven to a Tortured Mind by Yves Tumor. This is a neo-psychedelia art rock album, and it is the sexiest thing that's come out all year. I hadn't heard any Yves Tumor projects before this year, and I've heard 2 of their albums now, and this album, compared to a lot of their earlier work, seems to actually like take this very like psychedelic atmosphere and kind of streamline it into this pop package. The songs are so catchy, and again, like, there's almost this like swanky, very, you want to like snap your fingers along to it and like be dancing in like this very dimly lit room kind of feeling to it. I'm specifically thinking of songs like Kerosene and Superstars that again just have this like really dark and amazing, I feel like I've said the word vibe like at least 20 times in this video so far, but I'm gonna say it again because it's the only word I can think of to adequately describe how this album makes me feel. Number 4 is another album that popped out of nowhere. I listened to it like 3 days ago and it skyrocketed to number 4 of the whole year, and that is May Our Chambers Be Full by Emma Ruth Rundle and Thou. Thou? I had heard Emma Ruth Rundle before. She has this like singer-songwriter album from 2016 that's like kind of like almost a standard singer-songwriter album, but with like post-rock and like very dark elements to it, and I feel like that's what makes her so perfect for this project, because this album is like this post-metal, atmospheric metal album, which is not something I often gravitate to, but it is just like so perfect. You have these like really heavy metal instrumentals that make you feel like you're being sucked into a black hole, but with Emma Ruth Rundle's vocals kind of like simmering in the background, it gives this very dreamy vibe that you're in like this magical universe of darkness and lightness and stars. I think metal can be very inaccessible for people who haven't listened to a lot of it. I'm including myself in that category, which is why I think atmospheric metal is kind of a perfect little gateway into it, because I've listened to a lot of ambient music. I do a lot of that when I'm reading or writing, and so like atmospheric metal kind of gives you these like really cool heavy metal like notes, but like while still giving you this very accessible album. My number 3 album of the year is Songs by Adrianne Lenker, and this is just a beautiful document of beauty. Adrianne Lenker, you might know her as the lead singer of Big Thief, and I think Big Thief does a lot with like kind of playing around with their sound, going sometimes more rock and sometimes more folk, but this album is just like so stripped down of Adrianne Lenker and like these beautiful guitar patterns, and it's just this like wonderful breakup document of gorgeousness. Her song Anything off of this album is easily in my top 5 songs of the year. I think she writes about love and about this breakup in such a way that is so personal to her, such that she will say the person's name and yet so universal that like you can plant yourself into the situation, or you can like imagine times in your life when you've been there and relate at the same time as like getting to know her story. So I think it's one of like just the prettiest albums of the year, but at the same time, I am not someone who always needs great lyrics in her music. Again, I think just kind of, you can even tell based on this video, I listen for the vibes of an album or for a song, but like when you sit down and really read the lyrics of this album, it's just so clear how brilliant of a songwriter she is, and it just shines completely through on this album. At number 2, we have Microphones in 2020 by The Microphones, which is arguably the most personal and stunning document in art from the entire year. Scratch everything I've said about like me not really listening for lyrics and listening more for melody or feeling. This is an album you're gonna want to kind of shut off all the lights and just sit there and listen to the words, or maybe even read along with them. Microphones in 2020 is an album of one song of Phil Elverum basically telling his musical story and his life story. And that might sound boring, like, oh what, he just does the same thing for like 45 minutes and how is that not boring? It is so engaging because Phil's words are like poetry, his story is so personal, and the actual like folk backing is dynamic enough throughout the whole song that it keeps you engaged and keeps you listening. I'll admit that I think probably like one of the reasons that this album is so amazing to me is that I love The Glow Part 2, I love Mount Eerie, the album. I've never actually heard any just like Mount Eerie, the artist, albums, and so getting to hear his story and his words and with his music is something that feels almost, it's like more than music, and yet I do feel like you would still get something from this even if The Microphones or Mount Eerie or Phil Elverum or in any regard hasn't been a part of your life. Just like how personal it is, like, pierces through the music, that it would just like tug at your heartstrings even if you didn't know who he was before listening to the album. In many ways, I feel like you would experience it more like a movie than like a traditional album, because it's not something where you're gonna like go like the songs and put it into a playlist and then it'll come up on shuffle when you're driving. Like, you are going to listen to this album to just listen to the album and experience it and do nothing else while you're doing that. And I think that's something really interesting for music, because for me at least, and I know a lot of people, music can kind of be like the secondary thing you're doing, or the primary thing you're doing while you're doing something secondary, but this album really commands your attention in a way that I think not all music does, and I really respect it for that. And then my favorite album of the year is Ichiko Aoba's Windswept Aiden. I have been a massive fan of Ichiko Aoba this year. I discovered some of her music, I think early on in 2020, maybe even before lockdown, but her albums are so sparse. They're just like her and a guitar, and there's something so comforting when you listen to her albums. You feel like you're in the room with her. So some of her earlier stuff, like Zero or QP, it really does, like, you feel like you're just sitting in the room with your friend Ichiko Aoba, who's playing you the most beautiful music in the world. But Windswept Aiden does is it kind of takes that universe and expands it. You feel like you are in this beautiful, dreamy, aquatic wonderland of sounds. The album cover shows her underwater, as you can kind of like see the light flickering through the waves, and that's exactly how I think this album feels to me. It feels like when you're watching the waves and you see the light just gently glimmering on the top of all the waves. And I do feel like the way that Ichiko Aoba plays her guitar and the way she intersperses other instruments into this album, which again is novel for her because most of her previous albums are just her and a guitar, creates this very all-encompassing feeling. I think it's beautiful. At the end of the day, I do think it's an album that's in some ways very necessary, because like it is an album that I at least think will like calm you down while still being musically dynamic, and I recommend it to everyone. Those were my favorite albums of the year. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any recommendations, please let me know in the description. I listened to about like 53 albums this year, so I've probably heard some of your favorites, but there might be ones that you've listened to and loved that I haven't even heard of, so please let me know about them. And if you give any of these albums a listen and enjoy them, please let me know either on here or on Twitter or something. I love hearing from you guys. And that's all we have for today. I will see you guys next time.